They say the dead never truly leave in silence, not in the villages forgotten by maps, not where the wind carries prayers no one remembers how to speak. Welcome to folk fear, where ancient bloodlines whisper secrets through cracked wood and burnt offerings, where traditions never die, and where the ghosts don't haunt because they're angry. They haunt because they were promised something and never received it. In this place, folklore isn't legend, it's law, and breaking it comes at a price. Tonight's tale is woven from red thread and clay, sealed in ritual and bound to the soil itself. A village that feeds its fields not with water, but with brides. This is the story of the widow's clay, and once you hear it, you'll never look at a wedding the same way again.
The village did not appear on most maps. It was the kind of place you could only find by accident or by blood. Leanne stood at the edge of the stone path, suitcase in hand, staring down at the rusted sign hanging crooked from a bent wooden pole. The characters were faint, worn away by decades of rain, smoke, and silence. Shuimo, that was its name. It meant inked water, though the only thing flowing here was fog. The air was thick with it, a creeping gray that coiled around her ankles, slithered across the mossy rooftops, and swallowed the narrow path behind her. Even the trees looked like they'd forgotten how to breathe, their branches limp with the weight of something unseen. She hadn't been there since she was 9, and even then she barely remembered anything beyond the smell, a heavy mixture of burning joss paper, wet rice stalks, and something sour beneath it, like dried blood in cracked stone. Her grandmother had died 3 days ago. Leanne had come to bury her, or at least that was what she thought. The villagers did not meet her at the edge of the road. No one offered to help with her bags. The few she passed on her way in lowered their eyes. Some muttered under their breath. One old woman spat directly into the dust after looking at her, 3 times in a row, as if to ward off a curse. They knew. She wasn't just returning for a funeral. She was returning to a fate already chosen. The house was still there, tucked behind the tall stone wall with the faded peach blossom mural on the gate. A single paper charm flapped in the wind above the lintel, barely holding on. It was yellowed and inked in red, a Taoist ward, but long expired. The spirit lines had faded to pink. The characters had bled together like veins. Leanne pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. It smelled like death, not fresh, but lingering, the kind that had steeped into wood and altar ash, the kind that had been waiting. Her grandmother's body had already been cremated. The ashes were sealed in a black ceramic urn, wrapped in red cloth and placed on the ancestral altar. No one invited Leanne to the ceremony. She'd arrived too late. Or perhaps they hadn't wanted her there at all. On the altar were 5 other urns. Each one bore a name. Each one had been wrapped in the same red cloth, except the one in the center. That one was bare. No name, no cloth. Just the urn, raw and quiet. She stepped closer, heart thudding. As she stared, a small gust of wind drifted through the broken window. It was subtle, just enough to unsettle the layer of ash on top. And beneath it, Scratched into the ceramic surface with something sharp were 3 crude characters. Lian Hua, her own name. That night she dreamed of teeth. Not hers, not anyone's really, just teeth, piled neatly in a porcelain bowl, resting in a girl's lap. The girl was faceless, but her hands were trembling. Blood pooled around her thighs, soaking the red robe she wore. There was a groom beside her, head bowed, face made of clay. A smile had been carved into his mouth with wire. His eyes were painted on. He never blinked. When Liam woke, the pillow beneath her head was damp, not from sweat, but from something thicker. She turned on the bedside lamp. Her pillowcase was smeared with gray. Ash. The next morning she walked the village. Nothing had changed. Same sunless roofs, same cracked red banners above each door, faded from generations of New Year's. Same heavy silence. She passed a group of old women plucking beans outside a thatched hut. One of them looked up and hissed under her breath. "She's the last one. They'll take her like the others." Lian turned. "What did you say?" But they had already looked away. One of them crossed herself in the Taoist style, left, right, down, spit. And then one of them began to hum. A low tune, a sad tune. The same one her grandmother used to hum when she thought Lian was asleep. The same one she could never forget, though she never knew the words. There was a red string tied to her door handle when she returned home. Just one. Thin, bright, frayed at the end, and looped 3 times into a knot. In folklore, red thread was meant to connect lovers, fate, marriage, soulmates. The gods of destiny would tie it between 2 people's ankles or fingers, no matter how far apart they were. But this one wasn't tied to anyone. It ended in a noose. That night, she searched her grandmother's room. Behind a loose floorboard, she found a lacquered box tied shut with twine. The moment her hand touched it, a wave of nausea rolled through her. Inside were scrolls, old, brittle, wrapped in oil paper. Some bore burnt edges. One had a dark handprint on it, too small to be her grandmother's. She unwrapped the largest one, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a wedding contract between a living woman and a dead man. His name was smeared out, but the bride's name was clearly written. Lian Hua. She took the scroll to the village temple the next day, though temple was a generous word. It was a leaning pagoda shrine, barely held together by bamboo scaffolding and a roof of rotted tiles. Inside, the air was thick with incense, but the candles were all unlit. The gods were blind here, or perhaps they had turned their faces away. A man sat cross-legged in the back, wearing faded robes and cracked glasses. He looked up as she entered, and without being told said, "You should not have come during the 7th month." Lian hesitated. "You know who I am?" He nodded. "You were promised before you were born." The rest of the villagers stayed away from her after that, but not the children. One afternoon, as she crossed the abandoned schoolyard, a little girl came running from behind a tree. She clutched a straw doll in her hands, its face painted red, its body wrapped in black thread. "Are you the bride?" the girl asked. Lian crouched. What bride? The one they bury. And then she skipped away laughing, humming the same wordless lullaby. She stood there for a long time, and when she looked down, the doll was in her hand. She didn't remember taking it. That night, someone knocked on her window. 3 soft taps. She lived alone. The garden was overgrown. No neighbors nearby. She looked through the glass. There was no one. Only the fog, and a trail of red threads leading into the dark.
The clay figure sat in the shadows of her grandmother's altar room. Liane hadn't noticed it at first. It had blended into the gloom, no larger than a child's doll, its features smeared with time and soot. But when she returned after her walk through the village, something drew her to the corner shelf near the ancestral urns. There, amid broken incense sticks and a half-melted candle, sat the figure, a bridegroom. His robe was painted red, though much of the color had faded. His face, eerily smooth, bore no real features except for 2 painted dots where the eyes should be, and a thin slit carved to resemble a smiling mouth. She touched it gently. It was cold and slightly damp, though the altar room was dry. When she turned it over, she saw something carved into its back, a single character, Sheng, life. But beneath it, scratched more crudely, was its opposite, Sir, death. That night she could not sleep. She left the light on, pulled the thin quilt around her shoulders, and stared at the ceiling. The house creaked like it was breathing. The fog pressed against the window panes like fingers. And then she heard it, a low clatter, porcelain against wood. She rushed to the altar room. The clay bridegroom had fallen onto the floor. It lay face up, the smile now chipped. One eye had flaked away, leaving only a painted black dot. At its side was a single peach blossom, wilted and gray. But there were no peach trees in the village, not anymore. In the morning, she visited the town registry, tucked behind the old communal well. The building had warped with age, the bamboo walls eaten through by termites. Still, a clerk sat inside, old, sunken, with cataracts filming both eyes. He didn't look up when she entered. "I'm here to verify a death, my grandmother, Lian Suyin." The man nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting her. "Already recorded, cremated, ashes sealed, no spirit disturbance." She hesitated. "And me? Can you check if I'm listed?" The man paused, then opened a thin black book and flipped through yellowing pages. His bony finger stopped at a name. Lan Hua, born in the year of the fire goat, bloodline daughter, promised to marriage at birth, confirmed by thread, registered under ghost union rights. Lian's mouth dried. "I'm not married," she said, "not to anyone." The man looked up for the first time. His eyes were milky and blind. "But you are," he whispered. "You just haven't died yet." She fled the registry, heart pounding, and didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the village temple. There, sitting on a low step beneath a sagging lantern, was someone she hadn't seen in over a decade, June. They had played together as children, catching crickets in bamboo cages, stealing salted plums from the shrine, whispering ghost stories beneath the rice barn. He looked older now, tired, worn, but his eyes still held that same steady warmth. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. She sank beside him, breath ragged. "I didn't know about the thread, about the marriage." June exhaled. My sister. She was chosen the year before you were born. They said the rice had rotted, that a soul had not been fed. He turned toward the temple doors, as if afraid to say more. They took her in red. She never came back. Lian gripped her knees. Who is he? The one I'm supposed to marry? June didn't answer first. Then, in a voice that trembled, he's not a man, not anymore. That evening, Lian dug deeper into her grandmother's house. Behind a rotting cupboard, hidden beneath stacked bundles of joss paper and dried funeral wreaths, she found a second lacquered box, this one sealed with red wax. The wax was cracked. Inside lay 3 things: a brittle comb with strands of black hair still tangled in its teeth, a folded red wedding robe embroidered with gold threads that shimmered faintly despite the dust, and a small scroll bound tightly with twine and inked in crimson. She opened the scroll. It was a binding contract, not of this world, a Taoist marriage script, ancient and unholy. It read, "By thread and ash, by bone and womb, let this union stand beyond breath. Let the bride take the name of the groom, though he walks no longer among the living. Let her womb house his line. Let her blood feed the land. Let her name be struck from stone. Let her be clay." Below that was her signature, but she had never signed it. She barely slept that night, but when she did, the dream came again. This time it was her in the red robe. She stood at the edge of a pit, holding a bowl filled with something thick and dark, like wine but heavier. In the pit below, figures moved, hands reached up, pale, eyeless, bound in red thread. The groom stood beside her, not clay now, but flesh turned wrong. His mouth had no lips, just the suggestion of one, carved into his skin. His eyes were solid black, and something moved inside them. He held out a hand to her. She took it, and woke up screaming. In the cold morning, she walked to the hill behind the village. The mist hung lower here, almost clinging to the earth. The rice fields were silent, even the birds gone quiet. There was a small shrine at the top of the hill, a forgotten thing, overrun with moss. Its offerings were rotten, fruit blackened with time, candles melted into the soil. But there was a clay figure here too, another groom, almost identical to the one in her grandmother's home, except this one had been split down the chest, cracked open, and inside its hollow cavity was a human tooth. She staggered back and saw that the crack wasn't natural. It had been pried open, as if someone had tried to tear out whatever was sealed inside. June found her later that day, sitting on the altar steps, holding the scroll in her lap. "They want you to accept it," he said softly. "The villagers?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, the dead." Leon stared at the horizon. "What happens if I don't?" June looked away. "They take someone else." That evening, the village held a gathering. No announcements were made, but one by one the households lit their red lanterns. Offerings were placed outside each door: chickens, oranges, firecrackers, paper men. The air thickened with incense and dread. At the center of the square, an empty chair was set before a shrine, red cloth draped across it. A bowl of pig's blood rested beneath it, and beside it a clay effigy, a groom. Leon stood at the edge, watching, heart hollowing. A child was led forward, a girl no older than 10. She knelt, shivering, as an elder passed the clay groom into her hands. But before she could touch it, the elder stopped, looked up, eyes locking onto Lian.
He said one word, "Not her." Then to the gathered crowd, "The true bride has returned." That night, back in her room, she found a new scroll beneath her pillow, freshly inked. It bore no signature yet, just 2 blank lines, "Bride" and "Groom." And next to it, the clay bridegroom sat upright, smile widened as if it had changed since morning. Leanne didn't remember putting it there. And on the mirror across the room, written in ash, "The ceremony is prepared."
The fields bled gold in the morning haze. From her window, Leanne could see the harvest festival begin. Long lines of villagers wove between the terraces, carrying baskets of rice stalks, incense sticks, and red paper offerings. They moved slowly, like actors in a performance they no longer believed in, or perhaps had no choice but to follow. Bamboo flutes wailed in the distance. The sound did not rise with joy, it sank like mourning. A gong rang, once, then again, 3 times. The harvest had begun, and with it, the choosing. By midday, the center square was filled. Leanne stood behind a low wall of stacked joss paper, watching through the smoke. A large altar had been erected overnight, covered in red cloth and rimmed with gold. On it sat bowls of chicken blood, strands of pig intestine, cracked eggs, and a single severed rooster head, still fresh, the beak parted in eternal scream. Villagers lined up to offer small tokens: hair from a firstborn, teeth from lost children, shards of broken bowls tied with red thread. One by one, they dropped them into a stone urn at the base of the altar. An elder stood by the altar, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent chant. And beside him, half buried in the earth, was a large clay coffin, not shaped like a person, but like a hollowed-out body, a vessel waiting to be filled. Leanne's skin crawled. She turned to go, but something in her shoe shifted, a sharp pinch. She bent down and pulled it off. Inside was a tooth. Not hers. Small, human, milk-white, still blood-stained. She dropped it and fled. She ran back to the house, heart pounding, and locked the door behind her. But even there, the air felt heavier, a silence that wasn't empty. It was watching. She opened her grandmother's altar drawer and pulled out the binding scroll again. Her name, inked in red, her signature, still not written. She flipped the scroll. This time, the back bore something new. A map, drawn in rust-colored ink. A path leading past the terraces, behind the widow's tower, into the forbidden grove. And at the end, a single character. Bone. She waited until dusk. When the villagers were deep in prayer and drums echoed across the hills, she slipped out, wrapping herself in a shawl of gray to match the mist. The grove was silent. No birds, no crickets, just wind and the faint rustle of dry leaves. The trees here were older, crooked, bark split like cracked skin, moss hung like strands of hair, and beneath the roots, bones jutted from the earth like forgotten teeth. She followed the map. The path twisted between rocks and overgrown shrines. At the end, she found a stone circle. 7 slabs surrounded a pit, each one carved with ancient Taoist sigils. And in the center, a skeleton. Small, feminine. Its hands were bound with red thread. Its skull was split,
A comb lay beside it, identical to the one she'd found in her grandmother's box. Only this one had a name carved into it. May. A voice behind her. May was the first. She spun around. An old woman stood there, skin like parchment, lips stained with beetle. She carried no lantern, but the light around her shimmered faintly, as if the mist obeyed her presence. They buried her in the clay with the groom, but he rejected her. She bit off her own tongue to escape the binding. Leon swallowed hard. Why? The old woman smiled, toothless. Because she loved someone else. She followed her back to a shack hidden in the hills, more shrine than home. Inside were shelves of bones, tiny urns, and strips of yellowed paper inked with Taoist seals. The smell of dried herbs and burnt hair filled the air. The woman sat beside a smoking brazier and stirred a pot of black liquid with a jade stick. They feed the land with daughters. Each year when the rice turns sweet, the village chooses one, a bride for the groom. Why? The pact. She held up a burned scroll. The edges had been eaten by flame, but the character still showed. To preserve bounty, we give blood. To silence famine, we bind bride to bone. The sorcerer who defied us shall feed the groom until the world forgets his name. Leon felt the words claw into her chest. The sorcerer? The old woman's eyes gleamed. He was the last man to refuse, so they cursed him, bound him in clay, crushed his bones, mixed them with the soil. Her voice lowered. But his spirit still speaks, through dreams, through brides. As Leon left the shack, the woman handed her a pouch. Inside were black seeds. Bury them in your doorway, she said. If they sprout red, the groom walks tonight. Leon took them, numb. And in that moment, the woman added, almost gently, You are the last bride of the pact. After you, the bloodline ends, and so will the fields. That night, she buried the seeds. She did not sleep. At midnight, she stepped outside to check, and there where she had buried them, now sprouted 7 red blossoms, each one the shape of a bleeding mouth. In the morning, she returned to the square. The harvest had ended. The villagers were quiet. The altar had been dismantled, but a new object sat in its place, a wedding chair. Carved from bone-white wood, painted in crimson. Atop it rested a bridal robe, folded perfectly, and stitched into its hem was her name. And beside it, a second chair, empty, waiting. The villagers called it the Widow's Tower, but it had no windows, no stairs, no doors. Just a tall, narrow pillar of black stone rising from the edge of the terraces, nearly swallowed by vines and fog. Leon had seen it in childhood from afar, a shadow standing watch at the boundary where the rice fields gave way to forest. She remembered asking her grandmother what it was. Her grandmother had gone still, then muttered, "That is where the names are taken." Now, as Leon stood before it again, she could see carvings etched into the base, hundreds of tiny characters, almost illegible with moss and time. They were names, rows of them, women's names. Many were crossed out, but some remained, the ink faded but unbroken. Leon stepped closer. Her eyes traced line after line, and then, near the bottom, freshly carved, still red at the edges, Lien Hua. She didn't scream. She simply backed away, heartbeat thudding, until her heel struck something hollow. Turning, she saw an object half buried in the soil. It was an urn, scorched, cracked, and wrapped in strands of red hair, and it was humming. She returned to the house with mud on her hands and a tremor in her limbs. The urn was tucked under her arm, cold even against the morning air. When she placed it on her grandmother's altar, the ancestral candles flickered violently, though there was no wind. Leon stared at it, breath shallow. A scratching sound echoed from inside the urn, like fingernails tapping porcelain. She stepped back. A sudden gust slammed the front door shut, and then silence, until the whispering began. At first it came from the walls, soft, feminine murmurs overlapping one another in a language older than Mandarin. Then they began to form words, familiar words. The line is broken. She walks where she should not. The bride refuses her groom. Leon covered her ears. Still they came. He waits in the hollow. You must go to the tower again. The seal must not crack, or we rise. Jun appeared that afternoon, breathless, dirt on his hands, panic in his eyes. He said they dug a new pit. Leon stared at him. Where? He hesitated. In front of the tower. She followed him up the narrow path behind the terraces. The villagers didn't speak to them as they passed. Some even turned their backs. The mist thickened the farther they went, and then they saw it. A freshly dug hole, 6 feet deep, perfectly rectangular, directly before the base of the tower. Beside it sat a small wooden table, and on it a clay effigy, the groom. But this one was different. Its face had been carved in agonizing detail, deep gouges for eyes, a gaping mouth filled with what looked like tiny teeth, actual teeth. The fingers were painted red, as if dipped in blood. And inside its chest, visible through a cracked seam, was a human heart, petrified and pulsing faintly with unnatural life. Leon staggered back. They're preparing it, Jun said grimly, for the final binding. Back in her grandmother's house, she opened the old altar chest once more. This time, she found a folded bundle wrapped in yellow silk. Inside were 3 talismans, aged and brittle, and a scroll marked with the Taoist symbol for reversal. She unrolled it carefully. At the center was a drawing, the tower itself. But beneath it, buried deep beneath the soil, was something else. A circle of bodies, 7 women, hands joined, heads bowed, and in the middle, a man of clay, pierced by wooden nails, his mouth sewn shut with red thread. A curse, a prison, a warning. The scroll came with instructions. If the tower's seal is broken, the brides must return. If the heart is removed, the pact is undone. But the soil will weep, and the blood will spread. To reverse the pact, the bride must swallow the heart and stand in the circle, alive or dead. Leon stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, the fog crept closer. That night she returned to the tower, alone. The wind was sharp, cold. It carried a strange scent, sweet and metallic. She knelt beside the pit, staring down into the dark. The clay effigy had been removed. In its place was a white sheet, and beneath it, a body. Red robes, long black hair. The face was covered. Leon reached out with trembling fingers. She lifted the sheet and gasped. The face beneath was her own. She fell backward, heartbeat shattering in her chest. The world tilted, the mist roared. From the base of the tower, the stones began to glow, red lines seeping through the cracks like veins coming to life. And then the tower moaned, a long, hollow sound like centuries of mourning compressed into a single breath. From within the stone she heard a whisper, "You were never meant to wake us." She fled, but the ground trembled beneath her feet, and as she ran, she heard it, footsteps behind her. Not human, heavy, dragging, wet. She didn't look back, she didn't dare, but she knew the clay bridegroom had risen, and now it walked. Back at the house, she slammed the door shut and collapsed to the floor. But the urn was gone. In its place sat a bowl of black rice, writhing with something that moved beneath the grains. She backed away. At that moment, Jun burst in. "There's no time. They've sealed your name." He showed her a slip of parchment, her name written in blood, folded into a paper bride and tied with red thread. They buried it in the tower. The ritual has begun. They'll come for you before dawn. Leon stared at the slip, then at the scroll still clenched in her hand. The reversal ritual. It was madness, it was suicide, but it was the only way. She whispered, "Then I need the heart." Drun knit her ask, he simply nodded, and together they prepared to return to the tower before the groom could reach her first.
At dawn, the fog lay thick like a shroud over the village. Leon moved silently through it, her steps muffled by damp soil, the scroll tucked beneath her sleeve. June walked beside her, his jaw set, one hand gripping the satchel that held the talismans, the reversal script, and a worn dagger once used by his sister, the last bride who had resisted. The widow's tower loomed ahead, and somewhere within its shadow, the heart waited. But so did the dead. They approached the base of the tower, where the pit had been covered over with wooden planks bound by red thread. On top sat a bowl of blood rice and a small mirror cracked down the center. The mirror reflected only mist. Jun knelt and pressed 2 fingers into the rice. His expression darkened. "It's still warm," he whispered. "Someone was here recently." Leon's gaze drifted to the ground. Footprints, but not bare. Clay, large, toe-less impressions, rounded edges, cracks where real skin should be, as if made by something sculpted, not born. The clay groom had walked this path. Inside the tower's base, past the altar of bone and ash, they found a narrow passage hidden behind a tapestry. The tapestry showed a woman in red robes standing beside a man whose face had no features, only a carved line where the mouth should be, the eternal smile of the dead. Behind it, stairs descended into the dark. No light, no sound, just stone slick with damp and the scent of soil and old blood. They lit a small lantern, its flame barely flickering. The walls were etched with names. Each step they took was a step deeper into the forgotten. At the bottom, they entered a chamber. It wasn't large, no more than 10 paces across, but the ceiling rose far beyond the eye could follow, swallowed by blackness. In the center stood a stone pedestal. Upon it, a clay figure sat, its chest hollowed out, and inside, the heart, still pulsing, still alive, the vessel of the curse. Leon stepped forward, and behind her, the stone door slammed shut. The chamber stirred. From the shadows, threads began to fall, red, fine, drifting like silk from the ceiling above. They moved as if guided by breath, as if watching. One landed on her shoulder and burned. She brushed it away, but more came, wrapping her arms, her wrists, her throat. June lunged forward, cutting them with the dagger, shouting something in Hakka she couldn't understand. The thread screamed. It wasn't sound, it was sensation, like mourning being pulled through your bones. They receded, for now. But above them, the ceiling shifted. Leon looked up and saw them, the brides. 7 bodies suspended in the air, bound by red thread, stitched into the ceiling like marionettes, their heads bent backward, mouths open in silent screams. One of them still had lips. She whispered, "He is not just groom, he is prison." They retrieved the heart. It was cold at first, then warm, then blistering. Leon wrapped it in silk, tucked it close to her ribs, and turned back to the stone door. It opened without a touch, as if inviting her to leave. Outside, the mist had changed. It was no longer natural. It tasted of copper and salt, and it moved, swirled, laughed. Somewhere in it, a shape flickered, tall, too thin, head tilted sideways. The clay groom walked with jerking steps, like a puppet pulled from forgotten strings. They ran, back through the fields, past the shrines, past the sleeping homes, to the tailor's hut. The tailor was blind, old as the stones, but she knew they were coming. She opened her door before they knocked, her eyes pale and sightless. "You carry him," she said to Leon. "You've brought the groom's heart." Leon nodded. The woman took her hand and whispered, "Then the thread will bind you." She led Leon inside, where hundreds of red threads hung from the ceiling, dolls, charms, needles suspended in bowls of water. She pulled a long cord of red silk from a drawer. "This thread was soaked in your blood at birth. All brides are marked." She wrapped it around her wrist. It burned at first, then pulsed, alive. "Keep it on," she said. "If it tightens, he's near. If it bleeds, you've already joined him." Leon stared at the thread, watching it pulse with her own heartbeat. "How do I stop it?" she asked. The old woman leaned close. "You must finish what the first bride could not do." That night, Leon sat before the ancestral altar. She burned the scroll, not the curse, but the reversal. The ash formed a ring around her. She placed the heart in the center. Then she spoke the words taught by the blind tailor, words never meant to be spoken aloud. "Let the bride choose her path. Let the clay return to earth. Let the promise be broken." The heart twitched. The air shifted, and all the candles in the room went out at once. In the dark, she heard a voice. It came from everywhere, nowhere, inside her own head. "You were mine before you breathed. You were promised by blood. You cannot unwrite a name carved in bone." She held steady, drew the dagger, pressed its tip to the heart. "I was never yours," she whispered, and drove it down. The heart cracked, screamed, exploded into ash. A moment of silence, then thunder. The tower groaned in the distance, the earth trembled, and across the village, red threads snapped in unison. From the tailor's hut, from the shrines, from doorways and wells, the bindings had broken. But something else had awakened. June burst into the house, face pale. "They're coming," he gasped. "Who?" He didn't answer, only pointed. Leon stepped outside. The mist had turned red, and from its depths, shapes moved. Not the groom, not yet, but the brides, all 7, walking, breathless, threadless, eyes open, wide, white, free, and furious.
The village square was silent by midday, too silent. Not even the wind moved through the drying rice stalks, and the air was so still it felt choked. The mist that had blanketed the hills since the beginning of Hungry Ghost Month had receded slightly, but only to reveal what lay beneath. Red paint smeared on every doorway, paper brides hanging from strings above windows, bowls of uncooked rice arranged in patterns only the elders understood. A rooster tied to a stake in the center of the square, eyes wide, trembling. The wedding was today, and Leanne was the bride. She had tried to flee in the early morning, packed a single bag, taken the winding road down the eastern slope, only to find the path missing, literally gone, like it had been swallowed by the earth or erased by the fog. Even her footprints vanished behind her. When she turned to retrace her steps, she was already back at the gate of her grandmother's house. Time looped. Space betrayed her. The village would not let her leave. John had waited for her on the porch, eyes dark with helplessness. He didn't speak, just handed her the red veil folded neatly in a box of aged sandalwood. The cloth smelled like smoke and something older. By dusk, they had dressed her. 3 women arrived, none of them familiar, none of them speaking. They moved like shadows, hands swift and practiced. They bathed her with water that had been steeped in ashes, painted her lips red, drew 2 vertical lines beneath her eyes, tied red thread around her wrists, ankles, and throat. And finally, they lowered the veil over her face. She couldn't see through it. She wasn't supposed to. They led her into the square by the arms. No drums, no flutes, no laughter, just footsteps and the low muttering of an old chant repeated endlessly by someone she couldn't see. The altar stood in the center, adorned with burning incense, black candles, and plates of offering, roasted duck, sweet cakes, a bowl of uncooked rice with a single tooth in the center. Her stomach twisted. The rooster stood beside the altar, a stand-in groom. In rural rites, if the groom had died before the ceremony, a rooster was sometimes used to fulfill the ritual. But here in Shuimo, the meaning ran deeper. The rooster was not the substitute, it was the sacrifice. She was placed in front of the altar. The veil stayed down. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, though no one made a sound. Even the children didn't cry. The silence was unnatural, ritualistic. The elder began to chant, words in Old Hakka, language of burial, language of binding. The thread at her throat tightened slightly, a warning. She was not just being married, she was being sealed. The elder lifted a bowl filled with pig's blood and rice wine. He held it above her head. She could feel the heat of it, the metallic tang in her nostrils. But before he poured it, the rooster let out a shriek. It flailed, eyes rolling. And then, its neck snapped sideways, violently, with no visible cause. It dropped to the ground, wings twitching. Blood pooled across the altar and splashed across Leanne's red veil. She tasped, and then the elder said, quietly, with no fear in his voice, "The groom has arrived." The air changed. The mist surged back into the square, curling low around ankles, swallowing feet. Candles flickered. The red thread around Leanne's wrist pulled taut. From behind her, footsteps, slow, uneven, heavy, and wet. She turned, or tried to, but her body wouldn't obey. A presence stood beside her. She felt it before she heard it. The breath, cold and damp, brushing the edge of her cheek through the veil. And then, fingers, touching her hand. Not skin, clay, cracked and warm from within.
The groom had not sent a vessel. He had come in person. The elder raised the dagger, the final symbol of union, and brought it between them. It would be used to slice a strand of her hair and mix it with ash and soil, the last step. But the clay hand snatched it from him. No warning, just motion. And then the dagger turned on the elder, pressed gently against his own chest. The elder didn't move, didn't fight. He simply closed his eyes, and the blade went in. No one screamed, no one ran. As the elder fell to his knees and collapsed face first into the altar, the blood pooled quickly. The red veil dripped with it. The ceremony was not over. The groom reached toward Leanne's face and slowly, tenderly lifted the veil. She saw him. Not in full, not clearly, but enough. His skin was earthen, smooth in some places, blistered in others, with faint etchings like writing carved into his arms. His eyes were hollow, filled with swirling shadows. His mouth, a gash across his lower face, stitched at the edges with black thread that moved when he spoke. But he said nothing. He just looked at her, and for a moment, he smiled. Not the painted grin of the effigy, a real one, wounded, hopeful, longing, lonely. Then the villagers began to bow, one by one, row by row, even the children. Leanne turned in place, stunned. No one moved to stop the ritual. No one grieved the elder's death. No one seemed surprised, because this was not just a wedding. It was a resurrection, and the bride was the key. John broke the silence. He ran into the square, lantern in hand, shouting her name. "Leanne, don't drink the wine!" But it was too late. The groom reached down and lifted the bowl of blood and wine to her lips. It was not meant to be offered. It was meant to bind. The moment it touched her mouth, Leanne felt something slip behind her eyes. A presence, a whisper, not in words, but in sorrow. A sorrow so deep it scraped her bones. "You are the first to see me, and the last." She dropped the bowl. It shattered. The silence fractured with it. The villagers gasped. The groom stepped back, and for the first time, his face contorted, not in anger, but in pain. The binding had been rejected, the curse interrupted. A wind tore through the square, not natural wind, a tearing of space, as though something beneath the earth had screamed, and the land answered. Candles blew out, the sky darkened, and the 7 brides, still in their graves, began to stir. Beneath every altar, every shrine, every field, their threads had been snapped, but their rage had not. The clay groom turned slowly toward the widow's tower in the distance. His body began to crack, his limbs crumbled, but he did not fall. Instead, he walked, pieces of him breaking and reforming with every step, until he vanished into the mist, and the red thread around Leanne's wrist bled. She woke in darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the kind that lives behind the eyes, the kind that hums softly in the skull and weighs heavy on the chest. Leanne was lying on her grandmother's bed, still in the red bridal robe, now dried stiff with blood and ash. Her hands were folded across her chest as if someone had posed her. She sat up slowly. The entire house was silent. No wind, no insects, no human sounds. She opened the door and stepped outside. The mist had returned, but it was no longer white. It was gray-blue, like funeral smoke, and it moved like water through the empty village streets. Her feet made no sound on the ground. The red thread around her wrist had turned black, and it pulsed, as if something was tugging it, calling her. She followed the pull, past the rice fields, past the silent wells, past the burned offering tables, and up to the mausoleum. A stone structure long forgotten, half swallowed by the hillside, its entrance sealed with iron gate, chained and bound with yellowed Taoist talismans. But now, the gate stood open. The talismans had burned away, and scattered at the threshold were fragments of clay, thick, broken, splattered with blood. The coffin had cracked. Inside, the air was damp. The walls were etched with symbols of containment, old spells meant to trap spirits, to bind the dead. But many were smudged, scraped out, or oozing black ink, as if the stone itself had bled. At the center of the chamber lay the coffin, or what remained of it. It had been smashed from the inside. Clay shards littered the floor in a wide arc, among them bone fragments, old cloth and hair, too long and too much to belong to just one corpse. Leon stepped closer, and there, in the hollow at the center, sat a mirror. It had not cracked. It reflected nothing, until she leaned over it and saw herself, wearing a veil again. But this time, her eyes were gone. A wind swept through the chamber, and then, behind her, a whisper. Not words, a breath made of sorrow. She turned. The groom stood at the threshold, but he was different now. More formed, less clay, more flesh. The lines between the two had blurred. His skin rippled like it hadn't decided what it wanted to be. His hands dripped with old mud and old blood. His smile, still carved, now stretched, twitching. He said nothing, but he held something in his palm. A wedding band, made of bone, and he offered it to her. Leon did not move, not forward, not back. Her body was locked in stillness, but her mind fell somewhere else. She saw flashes, a village drowning in red, children buried under rice fields, brides scratching the insides of clay coffins, bleeding through their fingernails, a groom screaming without sound, trapped inside earth for generations. The sorcerer, face burned, mouth sewn shut, nailed into the first effigy. And then herself, standing alone in a field of broken urns, holding a child who had no face. She came back gasping. The groom was closer now. The ring still held out, but behind him, in the shadows of the mausoleum, she saw others begin to stir. The brides. 7 figures wrapped in veils, robes torn and bloodied, hands twisted, threads still hanging from their limbs like cobwebs. They moved with stuttered steps, not toward Leon, toward the groom. One of them reached him first. She lifted her veil. Her face was cracked, but her mouth worked. "You made us promises." The groom didn't answer. He simply turned and ran, not like a man, like a thing trying to escape judgment. The brides chased him into the mist, barefoot and silent, their red threads trailing like tendrils. June found Leon an hour later standing outside the mausoleum, barefoot and blank-faced. He took her hand without a word. Her fingers were cold, but she let him guide her home. As they walked, Leon whispered, "He's breaking apart." June nodded. "They all are." Back at the house, she washed the blood from her body, but it would not leave her skin. Every pore felt stained. She burned the bridal robe, but the smoke that rose from it did not smell like fabric. It smelled like incense and mourning. That night, she placed 7 bowls of water at the corners of the room, as the blind tailor had once taught her, to catch spirits, to give them reflection. By midnight, each bowl showed a bride's face, watching her, waiting. She asked them aloud, "What do you want from me?" And the voices replied as one, "Break the pact, undo the vessel, end his line, or become the next." Leon understood. The clay coffin had cracked, but the heart of the curse still lived, and it was her name that sealed it. Only she could finish what the first bride had failed to do. Only she could return to the circle, and this time refuse.
The house was still when she found the final scroll. It was hidden beneath the loose altar stone, one Leon had never dared touch before. She only noticed it because of the blood that had seeped around its edges. Not fresh blood, old, blackened, seeping upward from the ground as if the house itself had begun to weep. She pried the stone free with the tip of June's blade. Below was a compartment wrapped in silence. No dust, no cobwebs, just a silk-wrapped scroll, tied with red string and a lock of hair, not hers, but close. Same length, same shade, slightly darker. It was labeled in 3 simple characters: Shu, Shi, Zhi, Zhou. The sorcerer's curse. The ink inside had not faded, not a single stroke. It was written in an older form of Hakka script, more pictographic than phonetic. She could barely understand half of it, but the essence bled through. The pain was in the shape of the words. It told the story of Jing Shou, a Taoist medium summoned to Shuimo 2 centuries ago when the harvest had failed and the river turned black. The villagers had begged him to cleanse the land, drive out evil spirits, restore balance. He agreed, but only if no blood was spilled in greed, no bride given in fear, no name erased from the book of the living. They agreed, and they lied. Jing Shou worked for 7 nights, fasting, chanting, burning talismans inked with his own blood. On the final night, when he completed the ritual of sealing, the villagers came with torches. They dragged him to the widow's tower, newly built then, and accused him of corrupting the women with black sorcery, of inviting the spirits instead of banishing them. The truth was simpler. He had refused to bind a daughter. The elders had demanded a ghost marriage to seal prosperity. He refused, so they buried him alive beneath the tower. They broke his legs, shattered his jaw, wrapped his heart in threads soaked in ox blood, and poured clay over his body until he suffocated in the shape of a groom. But he didn't die. Not fully. His soul, trained in the deepest Taoist rites, clung to the vessel, too wounded to escape, too cursed to reincarnate. And over the generations, the village returned to him. Every daughter born was promised to him. Every bride sewn into clay was a peace offering, not for his forgiveness, but for their survival. The scroll ended with a final passage, newer ink, written in her grandmother's trembling hand. Leon, if you are reading this, then they have chosen you.
I tried to undo what our line began. I failed. But you were born under the eclipse. You carry the broken thread. You can return him to dust, but only if you find what they buried beside him. Not his bones, his grief. They say the groom waits, but I believe he mourns. Make him remember who he was, or become who they made him. Lian sat in silence long after the candle burned low. The clay effigies, the red thread, the altar bowls, none of it was random. It was an apology ritual, repeated every generation, not to honor the dead, but to keep them bound. Her own ancestors had started it. The blood was theirs, the silence was inherited. The line continued not because of faith, but because of fear. And now, she was the last one. She packed her satchel. June waited by the doorway, silent. She didn't speak. She simply held up the scroll, and he understood. They descended toward the fields at dawn, where the shadows ran longer than the trees. The villagers watched them, unmoving, hollow, as if their souls had sunk into the soil with the bones of the past. No one tried to stop her. Not anymore. Perhaps they believed it was already too late. Or perhaps they knew the curse had shifted, and it was no longer theirs to carry. The shrine behind the widow's tower was crumbling. Vines had cracked the foundation. The offering bowls were overturned. The stone lions wept moss. But Lian could feel it, beneath the earth, the pulse of something ancient. She knelt before the shrine and dug with her bare hands, layer after layer of soil and ash, until her fingers struck something solid. Wood. She scraped it clean. A small chest, rotted on one side, sealed with rusted nails. She broke it open. Inside, a mirror, cracked, a strand of red thread soaked in dried blood, and a thin bundle of papers. Letters, written in Jing Shuo's hand. They were not spells. They were love letters, addressed to someone unnamed, a woman never mentioned elsewhere. He had loved her, but she had been taken, bound in the first ghost marriage, swallowed by the pact. And he had tried to save her, but the village chose rice over love, and buried them both. Lian read every line aloud beneath the shrine. Let the ink, the grief, the betrayal breathe again after 200 years. And when she finished, she whispered, "She still waits. You were not forgotten." The wind shifted. The earth trembled, and a single voice echoed from the soil below her knees. "Then finish it." That night, the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain fell red, and from every field, urn, and altar, the spirits rose. Not just the brides, not just the cursed, but the forgotten. Children sacrificed, lovers abandoned, mothers who gave their daughters away. The village became a waking grave, and only one voice remained unbound, hers. She would walk to the tower one last time, not as a bride, not as a daughter, but as the breaker of the pact, the sorcerer's heir, and the curse's end.
The village no longer slept. It held its breath. Lian walked through the square at dusk, barefoot, clothed in white mourning robes now streaked with ash. The air around her pulsed with whispers, none of them human.
The red mist curled around her ankles as if trying to stop her, or perhaps clinging, desperate not to be left behind. The villagers did not look at her. Some hid behind doors, some lit incense with trembling hands. A few stood in silent prayer, their mouths moving through generations-old chants that no longer held power. They had given their daughters for rice. Now they could only watch as the last bride passed through their silence toward the tower that still remembered every name they had buried. June waited at the path's edge. He held the mirror she had dug up, cracked but still reflecting, a shard of the past. "I'll go with you," he said. She shook her head. "If I take anyone, the tower won't let me in." He didn't argue, just pressed the mirror into her hands and whispered, "Then come back, whole." Leon didn't answer. She didn't know if that was even possible. The path to the widow's tower had changed. The trees leaned in closer. The wind moved in spirals, not lines. The birds had fallen silent, and even the frogs in the paddies had buried themselves beneath the mud. The tower waited, dark, patient, alive. And at its base, the 7 brides. They stood in a circle, veils trailing behind them like torn banners. Their eyes had returned, wide, white, and unblinking. Each wore the red threads of her binding, but loosely now, the cords frayed, tattered, waiting to be untied. One bride stepped forward. Her mouth moved. "He's awake, but broken. He does not remember what he was, only what they made him." Another added, "We were supposed to hold him until you came." Leon stepped into the circle. The red thread around her wrist tightened, then snapped, and the ground opened. She fell into the tower's heart, not physically, not fully. She blinked and found herself in a chamber made of clay, the walls pulsing like lungs. The floor was slick with ash, the air humid with grief. The groom stood at the center, not walking, not waiting, writhing. His form shifted between man and statue, memory and curse. His hands dug into his own chest as if trying to tear out what remained. His mouth moved constantly, whispering names, repeating rituals, stuttering the same 5 words again and again. She did not say yes. She did not say yes. She did not. Leon approached slowly. He didn't look at her, couldn't. His eyes were turned inward, toward the moment the curse began. She knelt beside him, opened the scroll, and read the sorcerer's final words aloud. As the syllables filled the chamber, the groom froze. His mouth stopped moving, his hands went still, and for the first time, he looked at her. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of recognition, and sorrow, and something close to hope. "You loved her," Leon said. He nodded. "She was the first." Leon unwrapped the mirror and held it up. "Look," she whispered. "Look at what they turned you into." The groom gazed into the mirror. His reflection cracked and shifted, from man to clay, back to man, from groom to prisoner, from sacrifice to weapon. He fell to his knees and wept, not tears, but dust, each grain a memory, each speck a name. The brides appeared beside them, circling the chamber. They began to chant in unison, not a curse, not a binding, but a release. Leon joined them. She spoke the words from her grandmother's note, the only spell passed down not to preserve the ritual, but to undo it. blood to ash, ash to wind, bone to earth, name to silence. Bride unbound, groom returned, pact undone, the soil remembers. The tower shook, the clay walls cracked, and from beneath the floor the coffin screamed, not from pain, but from the sudden absence of suffering. The seal was breaking, the curse failing, but not yet complete. The groom looked at her, reached for her hand, said, "Let me go." Leon nodded and placed the mirror in his chest. The shard sank into the clay, cutting through the last threads of his imprisonment. He smiled, a real smile, and crumbled into dust. The tower collapsed. The brides vanished into light, not flame, not mist, but something clean. One by one, they whispered her name in thanks. Leon, Leon, Leon. And then only one remained, the first. Her veil fell away, and beneath it, a face identical to Leon's, but older, scarred, and smiling. She reached forward, touched Leon's cheek, and said, "You broke what they built," then stepped backward into the earth, and was gone. Leon awoke at the edge of the field. The sun was rising for the first time in weeks. The mist had burned away. The fields were quiet, and the village no longer watched her. It wept, in relief, in grief, in guilt, and perhaps in freedom.
The sun stayed for 3 days. That was all. Then it vanished again behind a veil of gray sky and sullen mist. The fields, once lit in pale gold, turned the color of old bone. The wind lost its warmth, and the birds, which had returned for a brief time, disappeared all at once. On the 4th morning, a bowl of black rice appeared at Leon's doorstep, and beside it, a red thread, fresh, frayed at the end, still damp with blood. The ritual was over. She had broken it. She had seen the tower fall, seen the dust take the groom, seen the brides lifted back into silence. But the land remembered, and it was not finished. June found her in the garden, staring at the bowl. "They won't let it go," he said. "The elders, the ones who still believe in the pact." "They're the ones who started it," she replied. "No, they're the ones who benefited from it, the ones who inherited it like a deed." Leon nodded slowly. "They buried the sin and watered it for centuries." Jun crouched beside her. "They'll try to take you," he said. "I know." He hesitated. "Then run." She didn't answer, because she already knew what the answer had to be. That night, the village held another ritual, but this time it was done in secret. No gongs, no music, no open flames. Just a procession of figures in dark robes, moving silently toward the old mausoleum, now collapsed, buried beneath layers of dust and memory. They gathered in a circle, carrying urns and ash, combs and thread, and one empty coffin shaped from fresh clay. The last vessel, made for her. Leon was taken before sunrise. They came while she slept, 4 masked figures painted like mourning dolls. They wrapped her in red cloth, bound her arms and ankles, and stuffed ash into her mouth
to keep her from speaking the sorcerer's words again. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply watched them with wide, burning eyes, and in the quiet of her mind, she thought, "You're not afraid of the curse ending. You're afraid of no longer being blessed by it." They carried her to the farthest terrace, the one closest to the mountain. There, a fresh pit had been dug, 6 feet deep, lined with red thread. At the bottom lay a clay effigy, faceless, cracked, hollowed at the chest. The new groom. Around the pit stood the elders, old women, old men, the village's bones wrapped in flesh, and in their hands bowls of oil, incense, and burnt names. They began to chant, softly, deliberately, words not heard since the first pact. Leon struggled. The ash burned her throat. The cloth choked her. They lowered her into the earth. The moment her back hit the clay coffin, she felt it, the pull, not physical, spiritual, as if the soil itself was trying to rewrite her, fold her name back into the pact, unmake her resistance, hollow her like the brides before. But she had learned. She knew how the curse began, and she knew how to end it. They brought the final ingredient, the heart bone, the last remaining fragment of the original sorcerer, sealed in lacquer, hidden for generations. One elder knelt beside the pit, held the heart bone in both hands, and began the incantation. Bride of clay, groom of grief, feed the land, seal the line. Then she lifted the bone to Leon's lips. Leon opened her mouth, not to swallow, but to speak. She spat the ash and whispered the words buried beneath her grandmother's scroll. Let not the womb be soil. Let not the name be dust. Let not the pact live longer than the love it killed. The red thread binding her arms burned away. The heart bone cracked in the elder's hands, and the clay groom inside the pit screamed, not with voice, but with wind, rising from the soil in a vortex of dust and ancestral sorrow. The pit collapsed. The coffin shattered. The groom's vessel imploded in a burst of red ash that coated the hillside like blood mist. The elders fell to their knees. Some wept. Some begged. Some simply turned to dust where they stood, their lives tethered so tightly to the curse they had fed. Leon rose from the grave unassisted, no longer bound, no longer chosen. And she said aloud, not for the villagers, but for the soil itself, "The pact is broken. The womb will no longer bleed for your harvest." And for the first time in 2 centuries, the ground did not answer. It stayed still. It stayed silent, as if even the land had grown tired of feeding on daughters. That night, Leon lit the last incense in her grandmother's house. She placed 7 bowls in a circle, filled them with river water, and set a paper lantern in the center. Inside the lantern, her name, written in black ink, folded 3 times. She set it aflame and let it drift upward, not to erase herself, but to return herself to life. At midnight, she dreamed of a child, standing alone at the edge of a field, holding a broken clay doll in one hand and a comb in the other. The child smiled
and whispered, "Thank you," then vanished into morning.
The thunder began before the sky changed. Low at first, like a distant drumbeat beneath the earth. Not overhead, not from clouds, but from below, as though something buried had begun to stir and knock. The villagers heard it first. Old men clutched their ears. The women at the temple turned their heads toward the hills. The dogs howled once, then fell silent. The infants woke with wide, empty eyes and did not cry. Leon stood barefoot in the ashes of the broken pit, watching the horizon. The wind had shifted. No longer the gentle breath of the rice fields, but something sharp, something ancient, something angry. She walked down the path alone, her robes gray with dust and ritual soot. The last remnants of the red thread burned into her skin like faint scars. She didn't hide anymore. She didn't whisper. She passed the well, now dry. She passed the altar stone, now cracked. And then she reached the mausoleum, what remained of it. The earth around it had split. The tower above had fallen months ago, but now the foundation itself groaned, like the corpse of a god rolling in its sleep. She stepped onto the stone, and the thunder answered. A crack split the earth beside her, then another, and then the dead rose. Not from the graves, from the soil, from the rice, from the very mud the villagers had tilled for generations. Figures began to pull themselves upward, some fully formed, some half-born, their bodies shaped from clay and memory. They moved slowly, mournfully, dragging centuries behind them like tattered veils. Some were brides, their eyes sewn shut, lips parted in silent screams. Some were children, arms still marked with talismans, cheeks etched with runes to silence their crying. Some were fathers who had signed the pacts. Some were mothers who had handed over their daughters in silence. They did not chase. They did not scream. They gathered and watched. June found her near the mausoleum steps, holding a single object in her palm, the cracked mirror from the sorcerer's chest. It no longer reflected her, only light. "They're here," he said. "They always were," she answered. "They're waiting for you to finish it." "No," she said. "They're waiting for me to choose." The last ritual could not be performed with ink or fire. It had to be done in blood. Not spilled, given, freely, not as sacrifice, but as severance. Leon stepped into the open mouth of the mausoleum ruins. The ground no longer resisted her. Inside, the chamber was darker than it had ever been. The ceiling had collapsed. The walls had folded inward. At the center lay the original vessel, the first clay effigy, now shattered. But within it, pulsing still, was the soul, not just of the groom, but of the curse. A tangle of sorrow, rage, memory, and silence. It hovered like mist above the rubble, glowing red, spinning slowly like a storm with no wind. Leon stepped toward it. She spoke aloud. "You were not evil. You were made into something evil, because they feared you, because they could not own you." The mist paused. It shimmered, then twisted. A figure emerged from it, familiar. Half man, half memory. The groom, but not broken anymore. Whole, unbound, and holding the same bone ring he had offered her once before. He stepped forward, held it out, and said, "If you take this, it begins again." She stared at it. The air around her burned. The village would live. The soil would bloom if she said yes. But so would the curse. The pact would continue. One bride every generation. One death to feed the rice. She looked into his eyes. They no longer begged. They waited. She took the ring and crushed it in her hand. Bone shattered to dust. The mist screamed. The chamber convulsed, and thunder split the sky above the mausoleum. Outside, the dead turned, not away, toward her. They bowed, all of them, every ghost, every forgotten name. And as they did, they crumbled, not violently, peacefully, dust to soil, sorrow to silence. The land accepted the return and let them go. The wind died. The red mist faded. The tower's foundation cracked open once more, and in its center bloomed a single red flower, a hibiscus, born not of blood, but release. June came to her as the light broke over the horizon. She leaned into his arms, shaking, not from fear, but from the weight that had finally lifted. "You did it," he said. "No," she whispered. "I ended what they began, but now the soil is empty." Behind them, the villagers emerged. Not all. Some were gone forever, but the ones that remained came with heads bowed, ashes on their faces. One elder approached her and said, We don't know how to plant without the pact." She turned, met her eyes, and replied, "Then learn." Because the womb of the soil had been cleaned, but it would never feed on blood again.
The first drop fell at dawn, not water, red, thick, warm. It struck the roof of the temple with a wet thud, slow and deliberate, a single blot of crimson spreading like blood spilled on silk. Lian stood in the courtyard, face upturned, as the next drop followed, then another, then many. No thunder, no wind, just rain, red as old rust, falling slow as breath. The sky above held no clouds, just an endless gray ceiling, as though the heavens themselves had been waiting for the pact to break before they began to weep. June stepped beside her, holding his jacket over her head, but she did not move. The rain painted her cheeks like war paint, staining the white mourning robe she still wore. "It's not blood," she whispered. "No, but it remembers blood." June didn't reply, because he didn't need to. They both knew what this was. Not a curse, not a blessing, just a reckoning. Across the village, the red rain fell evenly, steadily, and with it, the urns cracked open. On altars, in tombs, buried beneath floorboards, hidden in rice storage pits, tucked behind the old shrines. One by one they split, and from each came a sound, small, muffled, like breath drawn after a long drowning. The first to return was a girl, barely 10, eyes clouded, fingers clutched tight around a doll made of straw and copper. She appeared in the tailor's hut. The old woman wept when she saw her, not from fear, but from guilt. She had named the girl years ago, bound her thread, and cut her hair on the wedding night, then forgotten. Now the girl simply stood in the doorway, waiting. The tailor whispered, "I'm sorry," and the girl nodded once,
then vanished with the rain. At the edge of the village, a man staggered from the forest. His chest was caved in, ribs exposed, skin bloated with clay rot. But he smiled when he saw the river. He had died during the third pact, offered as a substitute groom to quell a failing harvest. They had buried him with a paper bride and told his mother he'd married well. He sat by the water, placed a coin on his tongue, and let the red rain take him. The spirits were not cruel. They did not scream. They did not claw. They came only to be seen, to be named, to be let go. Leon walked the village path slowly, barefoot in the red mud, watching them emerge from trees, from lanterns, from the open mouths of cracked clay effigies. Each one bore the mark of a forgotten vow. Some smiled, some cried, some stared silently at those who had once loved them or betrayed them. And when they were seen, when their presence was acknowledged, even with a whisper, even with a tear, they left. Dust on the rain. Names returned to the wind. At the village square, the final bride arrived. She wore no veil, no red thread, only sorrow wrapped around her shoulders. Her name had never been spoken aloud. She had vanished before the pact was written, chosen in secret by an elder who buried her under a false name. She came to the altar where the elder now sat, old and trembling, incense in one hand. He looked up, saw her, and dropped the flame. "I didn't want the famine. You don't understand." But the bride just knelt before him and took his hand, not in rage, in forgiveness. Then she let go and was gone. By midday, the red rain had slowed, but the village had changed. There were no more urns, no more brides sealed in silence. The clay coffins had crumbled, the altars had cracked, and the names that had once been buried beneath offerings now rose to the lips of every villager, spoken, mourned, freed. Leon walked the village path slowly, barefoot in the red mud, watching them emerge from trees, from lanterns, from the open mouths of cracked clay effigies. Each one bore the mark of a forgotten vow. Some smiled, some cried, some stared silently at those who had once loved them or betrayed them. And when they were seen, when their presence was acknowledged, even with a whisper, even with a tear, they left. Dust on the rain. Names returned to the wind. By midday, the red rain had slowed, but the village had changed. There were no more urns, no more brides sealed in silence. The clay coffins had crumbled, the altars had cracked, and the names that had once been buried beneath offerings now rose to the lips of every villager, spoken, mourned, freed. Leon sat at the edge of the fields, now soaked and blooming with red blossoms that had never grown before. Not rice, not grain, but a kind of morning flower, soft-petaled, fragrant. A child approached her, no older than 6, pale, unfamiliar, holding a comb in one hand. "Is it over?" the child asked. Leon hesitated, then nodded. "For now." "Does the earth still grow things?" "Yes," she said softly, "but only if we stop feeding it our daughters." The child nodded solemnly and walked into the rain. That night, a lantern was lit in each home, but not for celebration, for remembrance. Each household left a bowl of water at the doorway, and in it a reflection, no longer of fear, but of memory. The pact had ended, but the grief remained. Grief for what was given, for what was taken, for what they'd believed was necessary. June found Lian by her grandmother's altar. She was lighting one final stick of incense. "For her?" he asked. Lian shook her head. "For all of them." "And for you?" Lian looked up. The rain had stopped, and the sky, for the first time in her lifetime, was clear. Stars, no longer hidden, blinked overhead like old eyes reopened, and she whispered, "I'll light mine when I'm ready to forget."
The hill behind Shuimo was quiet now. No drums, no chants, no clay groom waiting in the soil. But the air still trembled. It was as though the land itself held its breath, uncertain of what it was without the pact, without the ritual, without the blood. Lian walked the final path barefoot, carrying a single item cradled in red silk, the last surviving shard of the sorcerer's heartbone. Everything else had been destroyed, the effigies, the urns, the altar seals. Only this remained, not as a relic of the curse, but as the key to ending it. The village watched her from doorways, some in silence, some with hands pressed together in apology, some weeping for what they could not undo. She didn't stop, didn't speak. She knew where she had to go, the shrine where the first pact was written, where the sorcerer had been betrayed, where the groom's soul had been sealed, the place where her own name had once been inked into clay. The shrine was little more than broken stone and rotted beams now, half consumed by roots, but the symbols remained, etched into the foundation, painted beneath the layers of soil, marked in blood beneath the moss. June waited there, carrying a lantern lit with blue fire, the kind used in ancestral funerals, its flame resistant to wind and time. "I couldn't let you go alone," he said. She gave him a weak smile. "Then you'll witness it." June nodded. The last wedding. They knelt before the cracked altar. Lian placed the heartbone on the stone. Its surface shimmered faintly, still pulsing, still alive, not with vengeance, but with memory. She unwrapped the final reversal scroll, passed down through whispers and ash. The ink was barely legible, but she didn't need to read it anymore. She had memorized every line, and with a steady voice, she began. "Let the bride be returned to the breath. Let the groom return to the dust. Let the pact be severed, not with silence, but with truth." The flame on June's lantern flared. The heartbone cracked. Wind whipped through the ruins, swirling in a circle around the shrine. From the earth, the voices rose, not screams, not curses, names. All the names lost to the pact, whispered in a single exhale, a sigh that stretched over 200 years. And then a shape emerged. Not full, not solid, just a figure of shadow and dust. The groom. He stepped forward from the air itself, no longer clay, no longer bound, no longer twisted. Just a man, young, worn, sorrowful. He looked at her with eyes no longer black. He said, "Lian, I was never meant to marry you." She nodded, eyes stinging. "You were never meant to be buried." He looked at the altar, saw the bone, and knelt beside it.
I've waited so long to be undone." His hands reached forward, resting gently over the heart fragment. It dissolved beneath his touch, as did he, not in agony, not in rage, but in peace, a life finally given permission to end. The wind stopped. The altar cracked down the center. The earth stilled, and from the broken shrine a soft hum rose, not from the ground, from the air, from the ancestors. A song wordless and warm, the lullaby of a curse being buried with love. Leon stood slowly. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from release. Behind her, June's hand found hers. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The ghost marriage had ended, not with a scream, but with a goodbye. Back in the village, the final offerings were swept away. The red thread that once hung from homes was burned. The clay jars that lined shrines were buried in silence. And for the first time in memory, no paper bride hung above the altar in the 7th month. There were no more names to bind. That night, Leon dreamed of her grandmother, sitting in the garden, weaving thread not for ceremony, but for a scarf. No talismans, no ash, just warmth. She looked up and smiled. She said, "You freed us, but now who will teach them how to live?" Leon woke before dawn. She opened the door to her grandmother's home and watched as the sky began to lighten. The fields were quiet. The soil, for once, held no sorrow. And she whispered to no one and to all who had come before her, "We won't forget, but we won't repeat." Then she stepped outside and began the work of planting something new.
Years passed. Not many, but enough. Enough for time to turn red thread into memory. Enough for the mist to lose its bite. Enough for the land to quiet, though never quite forget. The village of Shuimo remained, smaller, older, silent in a different way. The altars had been cleared, the clay urns buried beneath riverstone, and the tower never rebuilt. Where it once stood, only a single hibiscus bloomed every year, crimson and soft. Some called it cursed. Leanne called it a marker, a reminder, not of the dead, but of what was no longer taken from the living. No ghost marriages were performed again, not in Shuimo, not in the valleys nearby. The elders who had once whispered the pact had passed quietly, their names left off the ancestral scrolls by quiet agreement. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. They would not be worshipped. The children now grew without thread tied to their ankles. The girls were allowed to laugh without being told they owed their breath to the harvest. But the land had changed. The fields that had once bloomed with unnatural bounty now yielded only what they should, modest harvests, slow sprouts, sometimes spoiled by the rain. Some called it punishment. Leanne called it honest. She stayed in her grandmother's house, repaired the roof, let the vines curl around the railings instead of burning them away. She built a small garden behind the altar room, not for worship, but for herbs, flowers, vegetables, things that lived without sacrifice. And every year, on the night of the Hungry Ghost Festival, she lit a single blue candle, not for a groom, not for a bride, just for herself. June came to visit often, sometimes to stay. He never asked her to leave. She never asked him to stay. There was no pact between them, only time
and small shared silences, the kind that grow slowly, like seedlings in soil that once refused everything. One morning, Leanne rose before dawn. She stepped outside and found a box on her doorstep. Small, carved, wrapped in black thread. It hadn't been there the night before. Inside, a paper urn, folded with impossible precision and inked in calligraphy too old to trace. It bore a single name, not hers, not her grandmother's, a name she didn't recognize until she unfolded the slip inside. Then her hands began to shake because it was written in her handwriting, but she had no memory of ever writing it. She burned the paper before the sun fully rose, buried the ashes deep in the garden, and said aloud to no one, "You don't need to return. You were never mine to carry." That night she did not light a candle. She walked the fields instead, past the terraces to the place where the clay coffin had once split open. The hibiscus was blooming again, larger this time, and at its base, a second flower, still closed, still waiting. Leanne crouched beside it, ran a fingertip across its petal, and whispered, "Grow only if you wish, not because you were told to." Then stood and walked home. In the morning, she found a child at her doorstep, alone, barefoot, no name, no thread, no memory, just eyes that matched her own, and in their silence a question: "Am I from what you buried, or from what you saved?" She didn't know, so she knelt, held out her hand, and said, "You don't need to know where you came from, only where you'll go." The villagers never asked who the child was, only that she stayed, that she grew, and that she smiled often. Even when the rice did not, even when the rain returned, even when the soil stayed stubborn and slow, because they had learned, some fields will never grow again. But not all soil is meant for planting. Some is meant for remembering. Some is meant for resting. And some for never burying another daughter again.